My name is Ronald Frank Ratcliffe. I am the son of Bessie Elizabeth Baggett, my mother, who is interred, her ashes, at Coggeshall, St Peter's Advincula, Coggeshall, which was her church, and many, many, many years ago, mine as a choir boy in the church there. I was born in West Ham, London. Not a Londoner because my parents were not Londoners by natural birth. My mother was born in Southampton, and the point of her being born in Southampton is the very start of this story of my background of my life. She was born 1 year after, and a few days and weeks, the sinking of the Titanic, on which her father, Alan Martin Baggett, served as a first-class salon steward, having joined the Titanic from another White Star Line vessel, which had just docked in, named the Oceanic, on which he was the chief first-class steward. And he hoped to be the chief first-class steward aboard the Titanic. But the Titanic, people were being sent to crew it from all over, and when he got there, a friend of his already had the post of chief first-class steward, so he became a senior first-class steward in the first-class salon on board the Titanic, and joined it the day she sailed from the Oceanic, which had just arrived from New York, where the Titanic was heading for. The story then is, as it's well known, the Titanic sailed. As she sailed from the harbour, various things happened. The power of her engines sucked another liner off of its moorings alongside. Crowds turned out to wave her off, rather like a carnival day. And all in all, it was a fairly joyous occasion, although slightly momentous for Captain Smith, the captain. And it was one of those things where eventually the Titanic sailed and made its way down Southampton water into the open sea, bound for Cherbourg. At Cherbourg, the vessel picked up various people, passengers, other people making their way to the United States of America. It then went on to Ireland, and I think it was Queenstown, where it picked up many, many, many garden steerage passengers. In fact, my grandfather felt that there were probably 3,000 people on board. And I'm pretty sure that that is probably correct, because he and his friend and the purser would have known how many people they're feeding. And they were feeding people in garden steerage, and at all levels, as they were in those days, class levels aboard the liner, this luxury liner. My grandfather told my grandmother, who in turn told my mother, Bessie Elizabeth Ratcliffe, and that was her baptised name, Bessie Elizabeth Baggett. She was born at Itchen in Hampshire, Southampton. 1 year afterwards, she was born on the 18th of August, 1918. 1913. Yes, 1913, I beg your pardon. I've jumped ahead to the First World War there. 1913, she was born in that period afterwards, of just after grandfather had survived. So 1 year later, my mother was born. and she was told the stories of what had happened to my grandfather, because my grandfather never went on to survive for much longer. He served during the First World War in the Merchant Navy, and just after the First World War, he was taken ill, and he'd been to Gallipoli a number of times, where the famous British poet Rupert Brooke died of fever. He wasn't well, and he was ordered to be taken to the Royal Naval Hospital in Malta. Sadly, he died in the boat on the way to the Royal Naval Hospital. Many, many pressures were on him after he went back to sea after surviving the Titanic. One of his sons had polio and was in an iron lung. One of his sons developed cancer of one eye, and so he had cancer in his eye. And coupled with all of that, and I believe that he probably suffered from what we now know to be post-syndrome traumatic disorder. It would have been, he used to tell my grandmother, according to my mother who told me, that he would wake at night and could hear the screams of people in the water drowning. His version, as told to my grandmother and told to my mother, was that when the ship sailed, the first part of the cruise, if you could call it a cruise, or the sailing, or the crossing, was entirely normal. Probably very luxurious where he was in the first class saloon. His cabin was on the first class quarters deck. Then they encountered this iceberg. In this letter, which is a copy here, it was written on the headed paper of the Carpathia. It was dated April the 18th, and this is the headed paper of the Carpathia, written before the ship had docked in to New York, and before anybody in New York knew that there were survivors or that the ship had sunk. They were not expecting the shock they got. This letter card I'm reading now, a copy of my grandfather's original letter, written at sea, with the surviving passengers on board the Carpathia, and probably unique in its origin because I don't think any other letter was written in this form. He wrote the following, and it has connections with Chelmsford because he mentions wireless. It starts off at the top, and there is the heading, RMS Carpathia, Cunard, on board. He dated it Thursday, April the 18th. And he wrote, total saved, passengers and crew, 710 out of 3,000. Names of survivors went home by wireless. Now that would have been the wireless on board the Carpathia. It could never have been anywhere else. It would have been from the Carpathia to London, giving the details of what had happened. The Marconi wireless being used at that point on board the Carpathia, having the important role it had in saving my grandfather and those that actually survived the Titanic. And I'll come on to that later. Next he wrote, Dear Dad, because this letter was to his father-in-law, and he was a maritime person himself, and had been ship's captain. I'm not sure if he was the ship's captain of this particular vessel, but he wrote, "Dear Dad, am sending a line to Newport, also Bahia, in case you have already left for the latter port." So his ship moving on. "I was on the Titanic in the first salon for the voyage and intended to rejoin the Oceanic on our return. Out of the 110 stewards we had in the salon, alone only 5 or 6 were saved. She struck at 11 p.m. I was asleep, but woke at once, of course. We were ordered to the boats about 12, and she sank at 1:30. We were picked up at 5 a.m. by the Carpathia, outward to Gibraltar, etc. And she is landing us at New York tonight, where we hope to be transferred to the Cedric and home on Saturday week. The total number of stewards saved out of just on 400 is 46, as near as we know. There were not sufficient boats to accommodate more than were saved." And he has signed it off, "Trusting you are well, yours very affectionately, Alan." This is my grandfather, Alan Marden Baggett. He was a survivor of the Titanic. He was actually one of the crew in lifeboat number 9. Now, my grandfather told my grandmother, who in turn told my mother, Bessie Elizabeth Baggett, that at the time when he said in the letter, which I've held up and shown you, he woke at once when the ship struck the iceberg at 11 p.m. He told my grandmother details that are not in that letter. He said that when he went on deck immediately, on the first class deck, there were shards of ice all over the deck. He said there was a strange smell. He also said that when they were ordered to the lifeboats, and he was ordered to the lifeboat by a friend of his, Mr. Murdoch, who he'd served in other places in the White Star Line with, he was ordered to number 9 lifeboat because that was his appointed lifeboat station. They had not practiced lifeboat drills for the passengers. But my grandfather said that he got as many life jackets as he could and handed them out to first class passengers for the areas for which he was responsible. He then took up his post alongside lifeboat number 9 because those listings had been posted with their names on. When they tried to lower the lifeboat, and you imagine this, the lifeboat has got to now go down about 90 feet to where the ocean is icily calm, but nevertheless freezing. As they tried to work the boat out, he said it was very, very difficult because the ropes were frozen. He said it was very difficult to get them through the blocks. And my grandfather was from a seafaring family. My family have been involved in the sea for many years on my mother's side. Now the actual fact that the ratlings or the ropes were stiff with ice would have made the boat difficult. And he said it went down bows first. He used the term bows first and went into the water bows first. He said, but on the way down, they were dragging people off the decks because they wouldn't get in. They were dragging them off the decks and they were falling into the boat. And as they went down, Mr. Murdoch and the other officer with him ordered them to stand off, ordered the coxswain to stand off 100 yards away from the vessel. My grandfather told my grandmother, who told my mother, they expected to be taken back on board the ship at any time in the near future. They did not realise the ship was sinking. However, in his letter card he said that she sank at 1 a.m. By she, he means the Titanic. He told my grandmother, who of course told my mother, who told me, in these talks that I had to her as I was growing up as a young boy, the sounds of the people and the victims of this tragedy in the water were horrific. There were screams, gurglings. He said it was horrific. And the vessel itself eventually went up high and slid below the waves. He said there were explosions, everything as it went. But I don't know where that's recorded, whether it's recorded accurately or not anywhere. But certainly my grandmother told my mother that there were sounds of explosions, probably I'd imagine of boilers bursting as she went under. The fact is then that he wrote that they were picked up by the Carpathia outward bound to Gibraltar at 5 a.m. Now, the incredible thing for me is the fact that the wireless officers on board the Titanic, who were Marconi officers, were incredibly brave and accurate in what they did. I know because I am a qualified Morse operator, trained in the Royal Navy to a superb standard, and I believe that their actions were courageous because they did not get a dot or dash wrong. They transmitted the longitude and latitude of the Titanic, which was picked up by the Marconi wireless operator on the Cunard vessel Carpathia and accurately converted so that the captain and Captain Rostron, I would not be here, and my family that I have would not be here or alive to this day, but for the brilliance of Captain Rostron and those 3 Marconi operators, those on the Carpathia and those on the Titanic, and Captain Rostron, whose actions of navigation in navigating his vessel through Icelandic conditions, icebergs everywhere, to the very, very spot where the lifeboats were by sextant, is a miracle of mathematics and accurate navigation. And really, Captain Rostron's brilliance as a navigator and a captain is the reason, along with the wireless operators from the officers from Marconi's on board the Titanic and the Carpathia, are the very reason for my being. And I'm proud of the fact that I too became a wireless signals person in this field and can still to this day read Morse. As I sit here even now, I can think in Morse. These things, of course, with mobile telephones, They're all gone. They're all gone, but they're still being thought about because it is a fundamental method of communication between nations. And in those days, it was the only method of long distance communication and safety at sea. And it was in its infancy. My mother received a copy of the letter written by her father to his father-in-law, my great-grandfather. And when she was married to my biological father, that was given to her as a gift at the beginning in the 1930s when she was married, where she at that time was working as a very young and quite clever person with standard telephones and cables, she was promoted to inspector, and she was working, and they were working together with Marconi's of Chelmsford. And as such, she worked in that field all through the Second World War. And this is the closed version of the Carpathia letter written by my grandfather on Carpathia letter card, bearing the stamp, bearing the franking mark of the Cunard line, and postmarked by a post office in New York, either the same day, April the 18th, or the day after. And it's addressed to my great-grandfather, Mr. R.J. Buck, that is Mr. Robert Jackson Buck, and he was aboard the SS Transport, and he's addressed it to Newport News, which is in the United States of America, and my understanding is that those vessels were being used by the American government. So I don't have any other detail about that, and I'm unable to say without further research as to where the transport made its way to. According to the letter on the other side of this, my grandfather felt that his father-in-law, my great-grandfather, Robert Jackson Buck, might be en route to Bahia, which would be reasonably accurate if they were carrying items for the United States government. This is a photograph taken at the time when the crew of the Titanic that survived were virtually arrested on arrival and held and pending an inquiry. And my grandfather is seated here, and he and others were going to give evidence at the either the Board of Trade inquiry or wherever. My grandfather, bearing in mind the criticism he made in the letter, at the bottom of the letter, there were insufficient lifeboats to accommodate more than were saved, was never asked to give evidence. He was willing to, but he was never produced to give evidence, especially considering he was on the first class deck, in the first class salon, and in number 9 lifeboat, when he was sufficiently compos mentis aboard the RMS Carpathia to actually be able to record detail which included the wireless officers transmitting, the wireless officer transmitting aboard the Carpathia back to London with the survivors' names. These were firsts. Whatever the United States outcome was from their inquiry, they didn't call him in the United States either. And this is the picture here of them being held in reasonable accommodation, I assume, But on arrival on board the Lapland, not the Cedric as my grandfather thought, the Lapland in England on return. Bearing in mind the time, 1912, given the fact that 1912, what else was happening? The First World War was a very prominent feature, and there is absolutely no doubt about it at all. There was movement in Europe. The Titanic picked up people in Cherbourg, people leaving Europe because of whatever the movements were within the new phase of eras of development within Europe. So things were going on. Now, whether one could say, as a professional investigator, that the Board of Trade inquiry didn't do a good job would be exceptionally difficult to establish. However, one could say that possibly they didn't look at all elements of evidence available. I'm holding here two photographs. These two photographs, taken in Switzerland, have a story connected with the Titanic which is unique, to say the least. My wife and I, at the time before we made this visit, which is shown in this photograph, my wife and I had been married probably 23 years. My wife was in a single name, Rita Annetta Allegranza. She, of course, became Rita Annetta Ratcliffe when we married. Now, we had been married 23 years, and we were attending, because my wife's father and family are Swiss, her mother are Scottish, and we were attending a dinner at the Swiss embassy in somewhat honour of a lady authoress known at that time as Felicity Kinross. And she wrote a book about the famous Gatty family, who had connections with the Strand, the Adelphi Theatre and everything. And the Gatty family also had connections with the Titanic. Now, the Gatty family were employing waiters, some of whom travelled onto the Titanic. Now this photograph shows a plaque to a person who unfortunately did not survive the Titanic. During the dinner that my wife and I attended at the Swiss embassy, Felicity told us that she was going to start another book. She'd just written a book called Coffee and Ice, and she was going to start another book about another phase of the Gatty family. Now, the Gatty family were fairly wealthy people in Switzerland and made great success in the United Kingdom. And like my wife's father, they were all capable of speaking at least 3 languages. My wife's father could speak 5. And they were all educated. In days gone by, the British diplomatic service had sought the assistance of the Swiss to engage people who were fluent in a number of languages, whereby the members of the embassies of the United Kingdom needed people who could speak various languages. On this case, what happened here was, this plaque is to a deceased on the Titanic, and it transpires that Felicity told Rita and I that she was going to write another book, and she was going to write a book about the Gatti family and the Titanic. She pronounced it Titanica. And the Titanic element was going to be the central point of the book. Unfortunately, she died in accidental circumstances not long after. But it turned out that my wife is related through her father to the person who died aboard the Titanic, and his tomb plaque in marble is at the very church in the beautiful Val di Blenio in Switzerland, which is where my wife's father was baptized, Aquila. And the elements of that are that my wife and I did not know for 23 years that we had married each other in the form of, I, as a development from the survival by my grandfather and my mother of the Titanic, have married somebody whose family lost somebody aboard the same vessel. So the chances of that are mathematically billions to one. And it surprised my wife and I because we'd been married 23 years or more before we found out. And that came as a huge surprise to us. And it came as a huge surprise to me as well. And so there is the plaque in this photograph showing the recording of the deceased, whose name at the time was Abel Rigozzi, and he was from the very same tiny mountain village that my wife's father was from, and was indeed, we understand, a cousin of the family. So that's quite incredible detail. The story of Abel Rigozzi, whose plaque is in existence in the churchyard of the church at Aquila in the Val di Blenio, Switzerland, is that he walked, as many others did before him, to Cherbourg and boarded the Titanic. The situation is that he was on his way, hopefully, to the United States of America to make a new way of life and bring in money for the actual family back in Switzerland. Unfortunately, sadly, he would have been connected with the Gatti family, and many of those that were known to the Gatti family perished aboard the Titanic. A tragedy which is recorded there in that tiny church in the mountains in Switzerland.
So both you and your wife Rita have this amazing link with each other that you didn't know for 23 years of your marriage?
No, we did not. And we have this amazing link which mathematically, rather like the mathematics of Captain Rostron and the brilliance of the Marconi operators, is a mathematical equation which in itself is unique. I'm going to transmit the SOS as transmitted by the two Marconi officers aboard the Titanic when they used SOS to replace the previous emergency signal, which was in force throughout such beings of the wireless service as it was in those days. So Marconi's had trained their officers, and one similar training was aboard the Carpathia, and this was what they were transmitting. That was me saying, Titanic, Titanic, after SOS, SOS, SOS. Now you could, probably what happened then, as soon as the Carpathia replied, saying that they were receiving the signal, the two very brave Marconi officers transmitted the position and the longitude and latitude of the Titanic and the fact that she was sinking. Sinking. So that in itself was new. The first time that that kind of alarm signal, emergency signal, had been transmitted. Now it's well known to all shipping and aircraft all over the world, especially as my speciality in the Royal Navy was Morse code, coding, signals and transmissions and receiving. My view of the two officers was that they were two guys who actually exhibited extreme courage in transmitting the signal to the Carpathia and other ships, giving the accurate position of the Titanic, giving the longitude and latitude of where it was sinking, and making that so clear, not a dot or jot or comma or dash was missed, and that took extreme calm and collection of thought to do that, because it is easy to make an error on something as quick to respond to a sound as a Morse key.
When your hand is shaking.
When your hand is shaking, knowing that there's a possibility you're going to very shortly drown. And I would say that they were very courageous.
What time scale would you give it? The first report, as you said, was 11 o'clock strike iceberg. What's the time of sinking, and what time is their last known broadcast?
Their last known broadcast were just before the vessel went under, when Captain Smith, I understand, had released them from their position. The water was around their ankles, and they were still transmitting. Those signals were still being received by other vessels, and indeed the Carpathia, who was responding. And sadly, no other vessel in the area actually responded to that or made any acknowledgement that they were actually receiving the signals. So from the point of view of their positioning, their capability, I would not be here to this day but for those two officers who transmitted that very, very clear signal, giving the actual longitude and latitude, and the brilliance of Captain Rostron aboard the Carpathia with his navigational ability, and the brilliance of the receiving officer of Marconi's aboard the Carpathia in telling the captain of his ship, we need to go and rescue people. It led to one of their deaths, and I believe one of them was so badly frostbitten he had an effort to walk for many, many, many months after that. His feet were so badly frostbitten. And the fact that he survived from the water is a miracle in itself.
So what kept them there?
Their courage in staying at their post was something which is training, the training given by Marconi's, and their own steadfastness in the face of a critical situation is something which we, the British, seem to have produced over many, many years.
Would you like to tap their names out on the Morse code, starting with Harold Bride, please? And Jack Phillips, whose name will live forever. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.